Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Skidmore. I'm the director of the NCRCRD. Welcome to today's webinar where we have Norman Waltzer, who is going to talk about a project entitled Community-Supported Enterprises, Lessons Learned in Preserving Social Capital. Norman started the Center of Governmental Studies at Northern Illinois University in 2008 after retiring as the founding director of the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs, which is at Western Illinois University. At WIU, he had served as professor and chair in the department, in the Department of Economics, and then as dean of the College of Business and Technology. Currently, Norm serves on the Community Workforce and Economic Development team, conducting applied research, assisting state and local governments in policy issues. His areas of expertise include rural and community development, economic development, governmental structure and local public finance, and entrepreneurship in both public and private agencies, and community strategic planning and visioning. He regularly contributes to community and economic development literature. And so the webinar is about rural areas, especially those facing economic stagnation or slow growth, often find that essential businesses such as grocery stores, restaurants, and coffee shops that provide employment plus enhanced social capital are threatened by market declines. Some communities have turned to community-supported business approaches, where groups of residents invest in these establishments through nonprofits, LLCs, or cooperatives in efforts to restart or retain the businesses. So the webinar examines lessons learned by rural communities in Illinois, Vermont, and Wisconsin, and asks whether a country store model that has been especially successful in and so with that, I'll just remind everybody that if you have a comment or a question for Norm, you can type in the chat area. And with that introduction, I'd like to hand it over to Norm. Norm, thanks again for being here.
Well, thanks, Mark, and to Rosa for helping to set this up. Is my voice coming through okay? Looks like it.
You sound great.
Great, okay. Well, I want to welcome everybody to the webinar. I appreciate you taking your time. I know everybody's busy. I think this particular project is kind of interesting from a lot of different angles. And a little bit of the background on it, I've spent a lot of time working with rural and prior to that with some urban settings as well. But Dave Ivan and Greg Wise and I got together and thought this community-supported enterprise, as it's kind of shaping, and it's really relatively recent in the version that we're looking at now. And the way that's coming up is probably going to become an even more important issue in the future as we're looking ahead at some of the population projections and so forth for the rural areas. So we teamed together and submitted an application for seed money grant to the North Central and received it for a year. So it's turned out to be kind of a fun project, and so I'd like to share with you some of the things we found, and then maybe we'll have a little bit of time for some discussion. The game plan will be to have about a half an hour actual presentation. Dave Ivan then will say a few words about how this might be used in other areas, and then we'll answer some questions and do whatever we can. We just went through the description of the webinar a little bit. You can see on the screen now where the North Central report is housed. It's also on the North Central page as well, but you can get it either place. Is essentially learn some new approaches, find some resources, try to see some opportunities to engage local residents, try to share some information on what we can tell thus far has already been used. And we've been in about 20 or so of these CSEs, so we've got a pretty decent sample. The project was relatively small, obviously, so we're probably broader than we are deeper. So there's a lot more work to be done. We want to identify some useful resources that you might want to use, and then hopefully, if we're really lucky, have you take home some ideas for some projects that you might work on. So what we'll do in the presentation is spend a little bit of time on some background issues. Why are CSEs important? How might they be more important in the future? What CSEs really involve? And there's not a clear definition now in terms of different types of community-supported enterprises, but we've kind of made up our own. And I'm sure this will change with additional research, but it's a way to kind of get started. We'll take a little bit of a look on some financing approaches. And then there's been in the last couple of years really a growing role of intermediaries, and especially with the crowdfunding platforms. That's really kind of exciting. And a lot of cities are really getting involved in it at this level. Let's begin with a little bit about population changes. I think this is really an issue that maybe has been under the radar for some of the areas. If you look, and this is not the complete list of north central states, but it has most of them. But look at where the growth is really likely to happen, and it's significant increases. You don't have much happening right here. Actually, a decline, a little bit of a blip here, but this particular group, I think, is going to be one that we really want to pay attention to for a couple of reasons that we'll talk about in just a minute. But they're reaching the age of retirement. There's a big transfer of wealth. I mean, this group, the post-World War II group, really were fairly wealthy now compared to earlier generations. So I think they provide an opportunity, especially in rural areas, to maybe capture some of the wealth as well as try to figure out some new ways to move ahead. I would say, too, that while we studied these CSEs in rural areas, relatively smaller towns, they also can work fairly well in urban neighborhoods. So I think when you're talking about preserving an essential local business like a grocery store or a restaurant or something like that provides social capital, I think what you're really, any place you find that kind of situation, I think a CSE kind of approach would be suitable. So I don't think this is really limited to rural, but I think we've seen thus far, because of the kind of need for it, it's really been there. So why are CSEs important? Well, we've got the recession and the slow recovery. The shifting markets with increasing sales with the internet. I mean, this is pretty obvious. You just saw the population declines that are going to be projected. You've seen the growing population, and as these older people move on, then obviously there's going to be fewer people, in the areas. The business owners in many cases are not only getting retirement age, but they also have relatively few local heirs. So there's been kind of an issue who takes over the business, or does it continue at all, even though it still may be relatively profitable. There's been some limited access to private capital. Banks, for the most part, or financial institutions have not been investing in these kinds of smaller businesses. And the smaller businesses typically are overlooked when it comes to local incentives. So the ultimate impact can be that some pretty important local institutions are kind of being threatened in some cases. And if you're talking about a social capital institution, then it makes it a less attractive place or more difficult to attract new residents. So we tried to classify community-supported enterprises into 3 different types. Now, by community-supported enterprises, your first reaction is, well, it's community-supported if, in fact, we gave a low-cost loan or some free land or, something like that. This is really a different model. The model here is where we have active investment by residents into an establishment or a venture or something. And not only is it an active investment, but as you'll see in a few minutes, they actually are actively participating in the management of it. Not so much the management, but they're participating in delivering the services, supplying the materials or the products that are being sold, these kinds of activities. So it's not just investing, but it's also staying with it, trading there, doing all the kind of things that keep the business alive. So we have community-supported enterprises in general. Then we're going to talk just a bit about social enterprises and then some hybrids, and then see if we can kind of clarify a little bit for some of the distinctions. The community-supported businesses which we're looking at really they're a subset of the whole CSE type things, But by and large, they were intended to start or retain a key business in the community, like a local restaurant or a grocery store or a coffee shop or bookstore, something like that, that is considered really important for social capital. So they're motivated by this social purpose. They've had all kinds of different forms, so LLCs, nonprofits, co-ops, whatever. But it's a fairly flexible kind of model that's been used. Essentially, the community leaders are organizing and coordinating. They're supporting the ventures are inconsistent with other economic development thrusts in the community. In general, what's been done, as you'll see from the slides, the group typically buys a property or a building or something like that, and then subcontracts or hires a local operator to manage the business within that setting. And the local operator then can pay a rent back to the host agency. As often as not, the investors aren't expecting a financial return, but sometimes they are. And then the grocery stores and restaurants are pretty common approaches. Now contrast that with what might be considered a social enterprise. And a social enterprise is where you're really promoting a broad social purpose. An example would be in the west side of Chicago, there's a group that wants materials out of the dumps. So as a result, they're salvaging building materials that are useful, and then they're selling them through maybe a Salvation Army building or something like that kind of a model, and they're actually making a profit. But the purpose is not really to make the profit. The purpose really is bigger, namely to try to have not as much stuff go to the dumps and these kinds of things. So these social enterprises are typically a parent organization. They have a business venture. They don't expect to get ownership or financial return. They're not really involved daily in the management. So they're a little different breed. A third type of CSE, as they're being advertised, but we don't in the model that we were using. And that's basically a private business, like a brewery. And you may find that a brewery will have a kind of a club, a members club, and that the members in that club can then decide on what type of brew ought to be done next month or something like that. And they may pay a membership fee to belong to the club. And they're being billed in the public as a community-supported enterprise, which is fine, except that they don't really fit the model that we're doing here. So what we're talking about here in this particular presentation is really the first group. Namely, we're looking at businesses that either were in business or need to be in business according to the people in the community. And in fact, they typically are serving some sort of social role, social purpose, like building social capital, something like this. So a classic example would be a small town has a restaurant. The restaurant has been the place where everybody meets. All of a sudden, the owners want to retire. There's nobody to take it over. So as a result, the people in the community are pooling their funds, reopening the restaurant, hiring somebody to manage it. So that would be a simple model of what we're talking about. I just pulled together, as I mentioned before, we have, I think, 25 or 30 actual examples in a report, but a couple of them that were kind of interesting, and I tried to pull some that are sort of different and broad in terms of approach, but have some common themes. Colin Quince is an interesting example up in New Glarus, Wisconsin, about 2,000 population. They're essentially focusing on sustainable foods. They're buying unique local inputs. They're housed right downtown. They were started in 2014 by a group of people who are interested in preserving the land and organic farming and these kinds of things. So the goal here of Colin Quince is really to promote healthy lifestyles, have a creative menu, these kinds of things. And the way they do that is they have memberships for meals. It operates almost like a community-supported agriculture kind of model. And these were 2015 figures. I'm not sure that they're current right now, but they were about $125 for a limited membership and $360 for full. And they would get an annual member dinner. They would have discounts as making purchases. There were options for gifts and special events and these types of activities. So this illustrates the idea that, yes, it's a business venture, but it also has a number of different social benefits coming to the community. And New Glarus is known for like New Glarus Brewing and these kinds of places where it really has a focus on Wisconsin, trying to preserve the area to enhance local and local kind of activities. It also has a processing kitchen and canning facilities, so local producers can come and participate as well. And it's part of kind of a bigger New Glarus buy local kind of approach. Washburn Foods. This has been an interesting example because they've been trying to get a grocery store going for quite a while. And actually, with the Institute for Rural Affairs, we helped them in earlier years trying to get some of these businesses restarted. But the owner decided to close in 2000. They sold some shares and tried to get this thing going again. It then turned to a co-op in 2006. It was a $100 membership fee and then some rebates. It was operating as a loss, even though they had tried to develop some of the volunteer input and pricing strategies. And they were fairly creative in trying to market special services to the various groups in the community, but it wasn't profitable. They then resold to a private owner, and the owner then changed again. So now in 2016, they've resold it to an owner who currently operates the store. And it's basically, I think this point I wanted to make here is that Washburn has had some pretty significant cutbacks in major employers right downtown. So they've lost a significant number of jobs. So I don't think the model was faulty. I think what they're running into is some serious competition with other kind of places in the area for foods and chain stores and everybody else. But I think that they basically were trying to respond to some serious employment declines. So I think that they may have turned a corner. It seems to be working pretty well now. The future is yet to be determined. But it illustrates a couple of different points that I wanted to make. One of them is that you have to address all the local issues that all small businesses face. And a high percentage of small businesses fail. Well, the same is going to be true of this kind of a venture as well. Another one that's not all that far from Washburn is Tolon, and this one is relatively new. They've gone through an interesting kind of history, I think, that illustrates some things to bear in mind. So the original store closed in 2006. They started an LLC. They pooled some money. They bought the building. They had a new operator then in 2010. The building then burnt in 2014. And it was interesting when I just talked to them about it. It was so important to them to have a grocery store in the downtown that they were willing to make yet another start again and basically launch this effort. As you can see on the screen, there's 50 investors at $2,000 apiece. They raised a total actually of $500,000. But one thing that I think was kind of important here is that they got an operator, or have an operator now, that operates this as a second store. So he has another store in Wyoming, which is 10 or 15 miles away. So the economies of scale in purchasing may very well make this kind of a store as a second store more viable in a town of 1,292 people. So I think it illustrates being creative, and the local group was really very active in putting this together. Seemed to be a lot of local support, best I could tell. So essentially, the Stark County Ventures leases the store, provides free coffee and meeting space, these kinds of things. When I was there, they didn't have a restaurant yet, but it basically has a little bit of the meeting space. How do we have social capital? How do we build social capital in our community? Vermont has been kind of a leader in this small or in community supported enterprises, and I think for a couple of reasons. Vermont's relatively rural, not particularly wealthy, and pretty sparsely populated in a number of places, but it also has kind of a liberal bent, and it's the orientation is more towards public involvement, these kinds of activities. So Shrewsbury Co-op was kind of interesting because it's a town, meaning like a township for the Midwestern states, but it's a town in Vermont. So the general store closes in 1993, the elderly owner, obviously, And the interesting thing here that I would call your attention to is the family made a bequest to promote rural development, including places like Pierce's Store. So Pierce's Store is one part of the Shrewsbury Co-op. So the Vermont Preservation Trust, which is a state agency, they held an RFP and some responses came in. So essentially what happened, long story short, is that a group of members pooled the money. They raised $125,000 as kind of a good faith issue that we could make this thing work. Got a state grant. They did a feasibility study. They started a co-op. In this particular model, the members get a discount. They don't get a dividend or anything like that. But there's extensive involvement by the residents that they rehab a building, and the building had been closed for quite some time. So basically, they rehabbed the building, restocked it. The volunteers now operate the store. They have relatively few paid staff, but people are coming in on a regular basis, and presumably those are people who had initially invested the money. And they've had several managers, but it seems to be pretty stable at the moment. Another interesting point here, I think, is that the country stores that I saw in Vermont, I spent about a week or a week and a half in Vermont interviewing each of these places, but they were selling a variety of local crafts, local produce, bakery items, convenience stores. So it isn't like just a small grocery store. It basically is a community store, and it to me brings and illustrates the social capital kind of element to it. And I would have to say, having written about social capital for a lot of years, I didn't really understand it as well as I understand it after having been in Vermont. So they're also holding community events. They have a dinner, I think it's every month, and they have extra space that they're going to rent out for weddings and these kinds of things. So it truly is a country store model with a wide variety of activities. Putney, Vermont was another situation, 2,700 people. It was the store had been operating for a long time, selling the basic groceries and common items. They had a major fire in '98. The Preservation Trust, again, the state agency that has broadened its mission to collect funds and work with these smaller groups, or smaller places. They helped the Putney Historical Society, which is a C3, and they helped it to rehab and reopen it. They raised a fair amount of money from grants and donations. They rehabbed the building, and then actually an arsonist burned it down in 2009. And again, I think the staying power of this concept is really exemplified by the fact that they decided, well, we're not going to, just quit. We're going to do it again. So the PTV provided some additional help. So they actually raised some money. They reopened it. They actually expanded it. It's a nice little store with the basic grocery types, some local crafts and things as well. But they also added a pharmacy. So they found someone who in a neighboring community has a pharmacy and is able to get economies of scale and make this thing viable. So I think it looked like a pretty good operation. Another one was kind of interesting was the Hindenburg Public House. And this was a group, husband and wife. Actually, I think there was two men and then the wife as well. But they were trained in the Ben & Jerry's establishment kind of roles. They had been managers and stuff in Ben & Jerry's. So they really had a public commitment kind of attitude. So they started this restaurant on a former cheese processing site. So they had a $250,000 investment. They got a loan. They pre-sold meals like a CSA model for about $500. They had 80 investors. So they built the financing up in this way. But their intended market is really 9 surrounding cities in this rural area of Vermont. And what they do as part of their community development approach is to support local organizations. So they will have a monthly dinner. And if the local organization, they'll have a 3-course dinner for $20. And if the local group can bring in 100 people to attend the dinner, then the local group gets half the profit. And the group has to be in the targeted communities. They have to be a nonprofit, tax exempt, and non-political. So again, it's a social capital kind of approach that seems to be working pretty well, and it's built into their business model. Township Stores was one that I had looked at probably 30 years earlier. It's in Bonaparte, Iowa, and Bonaparte is a relatively small town, that's a very small town, that has been losing population. So the Township Stores, what happened in this model was a husband and wife had been in the community for a long time. They owned about 40% of the downtown. So they turned about 80 years old and decided they were going to go to Florida. So all of a sudden, about 40% of the downtown is on the real estate market. So a group of 4 or 5 people said, we can't lose our grocery store, our hardware store, and all the other things. So we have to do something to kind of revitalize this. So $8 a piece, they raised $100,000. They purchased and rehabbed some properties. They had loans and stuff, but purchased and rehabbed the properties. Investors were not guaranteed any financial return, but they started Township Grocery and a hardware store and a couple of other things. And this has gone on now for about 30 years. And what has happened is the town has continually shrunk in terms of population as people moved away. They've recently lost their grade school, or high school, I guess it is. And so the town really has been suffering a lot of difficulties that a lot of small towns have. But this grocery store seems to be going along. The collaborative spirit, I think, has been hard to maintain as new leaders, didn't emerge. The original leaders, many of them are gone now, or most of them are gone now. There's been some competition, obviously, from regional areas. People are able to shop cheaper somewhere else. But I think it illustrates to me the fact that you can, in fact, have lasting power with this kind of venture. It is still a stabilizing force in the downtown. The town has shrunk, but they're facing the usual kind of questions of tight profit margins and high merchandise costs and competition, these kinds of things. So taking this approach clearly does not eliminate the problems with the small businesses. It basically is something where you simply have to be able to manage them. But I think the motivation for the ones that we've talked about really has been that they felt a need or a void for somehow bringing this kind of business back. And I think part of that was really attributable to the social capital that it really involved. So what are some common characteristics? Well, they're socially motivated is in all the cases that we ran into. There's usually a local champion that's leading the efforts, 1 or 2 people, as is common in most economic development projects. I think most important was that it had a potential loss of services, or else there was an opportunity to expand, and this was a concern. There may or may not be a financial return expected. In some cases, if it's set up properly, they may be able to do a tax deduction for doing this, knowing that there's going to be no financial return coming back. Obviously, it required widespread community support. A lot of different organization types or formats were used. Frequently, if not always, they have locally produced item, foods, crafts, community activities. But again, importantly, they have to address the usual business issues. So you have to have some sort of a decent business model. Now, some recent things have changed with crowdfunding that make this, I think, even a more powerful approach. Many of you are probably familiar with the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Jobs Act. It was 2012, the federal act. And so the Jobs Act really set the stage for smaller investors being able to be involved in more speculative kind of things. So it took several years until the Securities and Exchange Commission rulings came out, and they came out in 2016. And basically, this allowed more lenient opportunities for smaller investors. You could get smaller investors involved. They could do different things and these kinds of activities. Well, following that, the various states passed their own legislation to take advantage of some of these activities and to provide more financing for the smaller businesses. And I just put Illinois as an example in here, but in 2016, January 1, we have a limit of $4 million with an audit, or we can have a minimum of $5,000 per investor per offering, these kinds of things, but each state is different. And what it means, though, is that we're now in a position that if we want to raise funds for a local business, we can do it with crowdfunding or other kinds of activities, which is a little bit different than the CSE model or why it was started. It doesn't really necessarily involve the community capital kind of a approach or social capital kind of approach, but it does in fact make it easier to do some things. And a couple of things I would just mention to you, as you can check them out later on if you want. But Milk Money started in Burlington, Vermont. It was two people who wanted to attract some money for some local businesses and who wanted to provide guidance and support to those businesses in helping them do a platform for raising money, but also helping them manage their business and get things started. So this has really just been started about a year or so, but it seems to be picking up some steam. Another one was Community Source Capital, and this thing you might want to look at in Washington State. It has really been involved in a lot of different activities. It's a social purpose organization, and it provides unsecured and non-interest-bearing loans to small businesses. And the way it operates is that the businesses must be able to repay a loan in 3 years or less, so they have to be solvent, and they have to start repaying the loan right after they get the grant or the loan. So basically, they have to be in a pretty good cash position when they get it. And the business pays $250 to start the campaign, but that includes some guidance and assistance in organizing. And when the funding starts, they pay $50 a month in monthly fees. And the investors then are able to select a business, usually a local business, and they're able to buy what are called squares at $50 a piece. So they can invest as much as they want to in a specific business. So as the business then pays back the loan, the money goes back into the pool, and the investors get their money back. They don't get an interest on their money, but they get their principal back. And that seems to have been working pretty well. It's been going on since 2013. Another one that's kind of interesting is the Local Crowd. That's in Wyoming, but they've now gone national, and they're still taking participants as they're going. But they wanted to help rural businesses, and they wanted particularly to help agencies like Main Street programs or a local economic development group, something like that, work with those businesses to help them raise money. So they have a set of materials, education materials, and other kinds of activities. And what they do every year, and I think they're doing it maybe one more year, but they had a phase 1, 2, and 3, and they figured out what the program was going to be. They then needed to prove it to try to get, they had a small business investment, or small business innovation grant. So basically, they selected a sample. They then tried their materials with that sample. They then went to the phase 2. And I think in Illinois, we have 3 cities that are participating in this particular program. But again, it provides guidance more so to the local development agency than to the business directly. But in fact, the business does participate. But it's kind of unique in that it's a rewards and donation-based platform, so that if you invest in this particular company, another store in town can somehow give you a credit or give you a reward of some type in their business, and that can count towards the investment. So it's very interesting and something that I think ultimately will probably go nationally, but it's certainly worth looking at. And another one to look at is Hatch, Oregon, but we're running a little short on time. So what kind of lessons have we learned? Well, it seems to me that social capital can be a driving force. We obviously, as all cases, have to have knowledgeable local leaders. You have to get some sort of motivation, even though the amounts of money invested are not large, but you still have to have people interested in doing something. They're committed to it. We found, I think, in Vermont that the Preservation Trust was really an interesting example where a state agency can broaden its mission and provide some technical assistance on this kind of a venture. Some of the groups that I talked with had some difficulty when they didn't have an operator operating their business with experience and was committed to the effort. So I think that's part of a key to the successes. Some of them used pre-sales like a community supported agriculture. Some of them didn't. It seemed like particularly the Vermont country stores needed to have multiple cost centers. so that you could have a cost center on produce, on meat, on groceries, on crafts, whatever it would be, maybe in renting your facility to weddings or whatever it would be. So it was a multi-based kind of operation. And so they, again, come back to they have to address all the issues that the small businesses face. And there have been some closures. This is clearly not, once you started, it's here forever. There were some places that looked pretty good, and for a variety of reasons, sometimes management issues or whatever, they basically closed. So, question I guess I would pose is, are CSEs in the future of your communities, for your rural communities? And it seems to me that the people that I talked with, the motivations really were retaining the social capital. And so I think that really resonates much more than I would have expected going into this project, and also preserving the quality of life. Now, I think we looked at rural places, but I think urban neighborhoods might feel the same way. The second question I would raise, and I'm not singling out any companies here, but can a private franchise, like a Casey's or somebody, can they build enough social capital if they're handling only the standard sort of line of merchandise? Or does it take community ownership? And do you have to attach to this community services like renting out space or having monthly dinners or these kinds of activities? And I'm inclined to think that you have to have the community services. I think it helps to have community owner. So that's just one issue. So the question then becomes, in the private sector by itself, can we build enough social capital? And then the question for you and me really is, what's the role of public agencies? And can we get residents to invest in a social capital kind of preservation activity? And then as I've looked at this more and more, and I knew very little about Vermont community stores, but I really think as I'm looking more and more at the Midwest, I'm inclined to think that kind of a general model might very well be reasonable, as some of our communities are getting, our cities are getting down, pretty small. So next steps, what we're trying to do now, again, this is a very small project, but we want to look at some other best practices. We want to figure out what the key ingredients are, what kind of community settings do these things work best. Can we prepare some field materials? Can we provide some learning environments? And can we maybe form a learning community about this kind of issue? So there's some references that when you see the slides on the web, you'll be able to at least get a start. And that's pretty much as far as I wanted to go at this point. And I think Dave Ivan is
Yeah, and thanks, Norm. And I think many of us on this webinar are engaged in community development. And adding vitality to rural places, or often rural places, falls on our plate. And so what Norm highlighted was how some communities have looked to add vitality to their main streets, to provide needed goods and services within their community, using many different models, but models that worked for them. And then along the course of this, built the social capital that kind of gives the community the hope, the courage to kind of attack the next thing on their to-do list and facilitating positive community change. I think all of us can look at the models that were shared here, and there's a much more detailed report that accompanies this research that will be valuable, and you can get directly from the website. But as we do our work, we hear frustrations in terms of communities that may be facing challenges in their communities. And so I think what we can do is say, there are examples. There are examples across the country using a variety of different business models, legal structures, product offerings that differ, that really provide the type of perhaps pathways that communities are seeking. And in doing so, I think we can provide hope. Oftentimes, when a store or a business or an establishment closes in a town, particularly a small town where it's been in place for a number of years, it's hurtful for that community. In some cases, it's a dagger in terms of creating a poverty of spirit. And so what these examples hopefully did was provide some opportunities in our work and your work with communities across the country to say, there are some opportunities and to provide some hope for those communities moving forward. So with that, we want to provide an opportunity for everyone to type in a question in the chat. Norm was the lead researcher in his team at Northern Illinois, so most of the questions I think Norm is probably better equipped to answer. But if you have any questions, please type them in and we'll try to answer them.
Well, thank you, Norm and Dave. So again, I'd encourage participants to type in questions you might have, and while we're waiting for those to come in, Norm, as you were talking about different funding mechanisms, and for some reason my thoughts turned to the State Bank of North Dakota, which is a public bank that funds a lot of things in North Dakota. It's an alternative to sort of the private banking structure and system. And anyway, I just was wondering if you had any thoughts about or experience with what the Bank of North Dakota offers versus some of this sort of crowdfunding and the risks associated if they can't, maybe they can't get a loan through the normal structures, and so there's this alternative, but does that mean it's inherently more risky?
We didn't look at Bank of North Dakota, frankly, and it was just because the project was relatively small, and we basically were kind of focusing on what we were doing here. But I think I've had as we've made this presentation to other places, we've had a number of different people ask, is it going to be risky for me to go on to crowdfunding or something like that and invest in a local business? And I think that was pretty much what we were looking at more was an equity type of financing rather than a leverage type of financing. And my response really at this point, because crowdfunding is changing so quickly and is growing actually so fast, that I think the ones that we talked about, places like we talked about Community Source Capital or Milk Money or Local Crowds, Hatch, Oregon, places like this, they really have almost like an intermediary. It's just between the investor and the business, and so I think the chances of a local investor losing his or her money are probably less than they would be by going through some sort of a crowdfunding directly. But it kind of varies. Everyone is different. But I think if the audience is interested in getting involved in this, I would look into the one that's probably most easily accessible is the Local Crowd in Wyoming, because they do hold competitions for individual cities or city groups to get involved, and they're developing some pretty good materials. And you can log on the website, and that particular one is https://thelocalcrowd.com. But again, when you get the report, we have all of these that are pretty well listed in there. Okay, we have a question from Andy.
Yeah, thank you.
I have not seen, Andy, at this point anything on conscious capitalism, but there probably are hundreds of community-supported enterprises in one shape or another. And when we started, we couldn't find a directory of any of them, and so we basically had to figure out, so what are these things and where are they located? So I think we have just touched the tip of the iceberg. I think the easiest for us was Vermont because they're so well advanced, but they keep popping up all over. And we have a list in the report of it's 3 or 4 pages of various states, and there's probably 100 to 150 CSEs listed there. So you may want to be able to, you should be able to go back there and see if you can find a title that seems pretty reasonable. Okay, Chris Merritt is asking, some of the community supported. I think Chris Merritt was asking, who basically are we marketing these kind of businesses to? What do we tell the businesses? How do the people people with money and so forth, how is it easy to get to them, or is it easy to get to them? I think the whole idea, at least the ones that I saw, they were relatively small, so everybody in town knew each other, so that really helps. But we had a couple of them that we looked at that were in the 4,000 and 5,000 population range, so it was a marketing effort. And I think key to this effort really was to have the local leaders out kind of putting their reputation on the line, basically saying, we all want to keep our grocery store, for example. And in fact, we've looked at a serious business model. We think we can make it happen. We have confidence. And they weren't asking for big amounts of money. In a lot of cases, $500, maybe $100, whatever it turns out to be, whatever the financing campaign was. But it was really a extensive marketing to the people in the community, or at least to potential customers. And I think it was really the kind of goodwill of the community wanting to preserve this social capital, but also to preserve access to groceries or, whatever they were trying to merchandise. So I think if we had some sort of, I think as this gets going, we'll have more and more information on it. This report, for example, has quite a bit of information on it. If other people pick it up and start, publicizing it and using it, we just couldn't find a whole lot written on CSEs when we started the project. But I think it'll happen. It'll grow. So that would be my thought. That we try to do some training. We try to do some education. We try to provide some input. Most of these places. The banks were involved, or financial institutions were involved, but you might have something like the residents raised $250,000, and then the bank might have a loan of $150,000 or $200,000 or something like that. So it was a solid business package that they put together, but it started with these individual investors putting in manageable kind of money. And in some instances, somebody would have left the community, had made some money, and would then, chip in as well. But it was a real community fundraising kind of effort. Anybody else have a question?
Well, I don't see anybody else typing here, so maybe now is a good time to stop. If you have some additional questions, you can always contact Norm and Dave or Greg directly. So maybe we'll stop there, Norm.
Okay, that's great. I really appreciate your time, and it's been a fun project. And again, if we can help you at all, feel free to give me a call.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks to the participants, and have a good afternoon.
Take care.